Hi folks, it's lovely to be here. It's maybe a bit different to normal. We didn't manage to record the service when we were in Buchanan Church today, so I didn't want to leave you hanging. So I thought, well, I'll record the kind of meat of the service today and I'll put it on YouTube. And just as well, a message just to say thank you for all of you who every week log in and watch this service. It really does mean a lot to us. We know that many of you are housebound and unable to come out, or maybe you've missed a service. And just want to say that you're loved and you're welcome in this place. So the reading this week, I'll read it for you, is from Hebrews chapter 10. So you might want to follow along if you've got a Bible near you. And it's Hebrews chapter 10, verses 19 to 25. So let me get that ready for you and I'll read it to you. Verse 19. Therefore, brothers, since we have confidence to enter the most holy place by the blood of Jesus, by a new and living way opened for us through the curtain, that is, his body, and since we have a great priest over the house of God, let us draw near to God with a sincere heart, in full assurance of faith, having our hearts sprinkled to cleanse us from a guilty conscience, and having our bodies washed with pure water. Let us hold unswervingly to the hope we profess, for he who promised is faithful. And let us consider how we may spur one another on towards love and good deeds. Let us not give up on meeting together as some are in the habit of doing, but let us encourage one another, and all the more as you see the day approaching. So that's our reading from Hebrews today. I'm sorry that there's no singing today. I'll not regale you with my singing voice as we do that. So, if you were with us last week, or if you watched last week, you'll remember that we were beginning this process of reinvigorating our small groups. Now, I'm very aware that I'm speaking to an audience that is sat at home. Perhaps you're somebody who you can't leave your house, and so your church community is online. But I'm hoping that today, what you might get is a sense that actually there's an opportunity. Small groups give us a chance in maybe your home, maybe visiting somebody else's home who you feel comfortable in. Maybe it's a locality thing. Maybe you live down in Glasgow and maybe you can gather together with people down there. But there's something really special about small groups and gathering together. So we're going to be delving into that today. And so last week, you might remember that we took a deep dive into this fundamental Christian belief that we are, as human beings, made for each other. We're made for community. And that's because in the language of Genesis, we're made, as it says, in the image of God. And what can we say about God? We can say one thing for certain, that he is a relationship of three people. You know, when John says God is love, that is 100% true. And it's true because that's the essence, that love is the basic value at the heart of God, because he's a relationship of three. And so we're made in that image. And so we too are made for community. So I suppose last week we set up our stall and said that as a collective, that is the kind of fundamental nature of what it is to be a Christian and to be a human being. And I think you'll have heard echoes of that in our reading that we had from Hebrews today. And all that background that we discussed was to suggest that meeting and being together, both here in the kind of body as we were and in smaller groups, it kind of embodies that. It recognises how important togetherness is. And so today is a bit more practically focused. Now, if you decide at some point to take part in a small group and gather together, there are some real benefits that you and your faith can gain from being part of that. And perhaps the most obvious benefit is that this kind of gathering, when we are in a wider setting, so imagine that you're going to a church service and maybe there's 60 or 70 people there, and we meet together for 58 minutes and we sing some songs and we listen to this kind of quasi lecture that I'm giving and we pray. Most of us grew up and that was our experience of church. So let's help ourselves by using the language of passive and active. When we're in a congregation, even when you're watching online, it's a passive activity. In fact, even more so online. It kind of leans into that kind of consumer experience of church. We can sit there and consume content like we would in a theatre. And even online, it's a bit like on your telly, you might be able to watch Netflix after this sermon, just in the same way that you can turn this on once a week. You can turn on EastEnders or whatever it is you want to watch. Yes, when we gather together in a church, we will stand and sing and we'll repeat the Lord's Prayer and we'll have a nice chat over coffee. And there's interaction for sure in our services, but it's mostly like eye contact. Maybe a little bit in the all age talk where, I go around and ask for people's answers on things. But that's not quite what we read last week in Acts, nor is it what we read in this Hebrews passage today. Now, don't get me wrong. There's something really good and important about gathering in a bigger body, in a beautiful building, and singing and teaching and contemplating. But sometimes that disenfranchises us. It makes us a little bit sedentary in the collective nature of our faith. And so a small group can be a great place where we gather with less people and journey together as much more active. There's that word again, active and passive. We're much more active if we're in a smaller group. It's a place where you've got more ownership, you've got more of a stake, where you're more intimately involved in the to and fro. It's more like a conversation. And actually, there are groups already living out this sort of reality. There's already some Route 66 groups that are continuing on from the past. There's a pastoral group. There's even the session, you could say, was a group of sorts. And maybe the difference in small groups is that it allows us to wrestle with the Bible in a completely different way to Sundays. There's something about a small group that increases our biblical literacy, and that inherently brings us closer to God. What do I mean by that? Well, as Christians, presumably we want to know Jesus a bit better. And like any relationship, that takes time. It means spending time together. It means conversation. And so we do that. We pray to God. We spend time with him. But the reality is that until the eschaton, which is just this big word that means the kind of end of time when Jesus comes back, until then, we have a sort of truncated access to Jesus. So how do we get to know him better now? Yes, all those things were said before, but a lot of it is simply by reading the Bible. It's through the gospel stories of the actual Jesus, the God-man that we worship. It's wrestling with these beautiful texts of the 66 books in the Bible. That's the primary avenue for getting to know God. He reshapes our lives through it. We become more like him, and we hear of his love for us, and we're inspired by his sacrifice, and it's in the Bible. And a small group allows us to do that, to inquire into our faith in a much more relaxed environment where we can learn from each other's collective wisdom. 2 weeks ago, I was at my friend Chris's funeral back in my home church in Belhaven. And Chris died in his 90s. But 20 years ago, when Sally and I were in our mid-20s, a young married couple, and we were part of a small group, and Chris was there along with a whole bunch of other people. And in that group, there was a 50-year kind of age gap, spread of ages. There was a whole bunch of different people that were in that group. And I remember that I was able to glean so much from Chris's decades of kind of Christian wisdom that he lived out. I can still vividly remember moments, like little things that he said that we talked about and teased out together that form part of my understanding even today. So in a small group, there's this deep benefit in gathering together around the Bible with brothers and sisters in faith. But perhaps you've got probably the most obvious benefit already in your minds. And that is that small groups are summed up in this little phrase that we've got in verse 25 of this passage of the Hebrews reading, where it says, "Let us encourage one another." The Good News Bible says, "Let us be concerned for one another." And we see that, don't we, throughout the New Testament. The letters in the New Testament are predominantly written to little communities of faith, and they're caring, they're pastoral letters. We've got our wonderful pastoral team here in Drymen and East Loch Lomond Church, and we try our best to look out for those like yourselves who are at home, going through difficult times, in hospital, housebound. But smaller groups of regular gathering, where there are 7 or 8 of you, There's something magical about that. You will be noticed when you're missing, not in a bad way, but in a caring way. You'll have shared some of your life with them. They can perceive when you're down and they'll pray and listen and love you. That's something really special about a small group. I can't tell you how many times I've been out to visit some of you folks out in your homes, and you've told me how important it has been to have had a small group praying for you in the past. It's much more difficult to do that on a Sunday morning. We can kind of breeze in and out of a church building, and we can put a mask on or a brave face. We can come in and nobody really notices us, not properly anyway. We don't sit down next to the person and say, do you know, I'm really struggling with my addiction to online gambling. Or I'm struggling because my son has just left his wife. Or I feel God is so far away from me right now. But with friends, real Christian friends who honour you and who see you in their home in a safe place, it can be a real support to each other. And we can't overlook how important friendship and support is in our new congregation as we consolidate ourselves as Drymen and East Loch Lomond Church. There's been big changes here in our church environment, and one surefire way of continuing our successful marriage, we've kind of called it, is relationships. Getting to know people and know them really well. It sounds so straightforward, and yet it's profound when it comes to fostering a feeling of belonging, of all of us being part of this one movement, a kind of unity. The thing is, this highlights maybe a much more uncomfortable but just as important benefit to small groups. It's like two sides of a coin. On one side you have pastoral support, but on the other side you have accountability. It's a big scary word, that, accountability. And it'll no doubt strike fear into some of us, because who of us really chooses vulnerability over the masks that we wear? Yet whether it's in counselling, or whether it's in your marriage or with your children, or being a Christ follower, being vulnerable leads to growth and deepens life. It's just harder to hide in a small group because you're kind of eyeballing each other. You know, when I was working at White Inch Church, where I did down in Glasgow for the first kind of 5 or 6, 7 years of my working life, we had this saying of what we were trying to achieve in our relationship as a church. And we talked about it being high accountability and low control. That's the kind of culture we wanted to have. High accountability, but low control. And the essence of this was that we wanted to be a church that didn't tell people what to do, because that just leads to huge problems. Lack of ownership, it's overbearing, it's ungodly, it can create bitterness. Instead, we were wanting to create a culture within that church where we held each other accountable to what we said. At a very simple level, if you put your hand up and say, yep, I'm going to paint the wall, but then you never do it, is it not perfectly okay for your friend to come alongside you and say, hey, is there a reason you've not painted the wall yet? That's a very trite example, but it indicates how holding ourselves accountable to others for what we say is a gift. And it's something that we do already in so many different scenarios, particularly in our marriages. One of the most brilliant things about weddings that I love is the couple, and they're coming for this public announcement to say to the world, I love this person and I will be with them, come what may, forever. Now, you can whisper that to your partner in the privacy of a bedroom, but to say it in a public environment, in front of these people, it's like saying, hold us accountable to what we're saying. That's why weddings are public occasions, because people will hold us accountable. When I say, I've had enough, I'm out of this marriage, we can go alongside them, we can come alongside them and say, that's not what you said. And that's true of our faith as well. When we allow ourselves to be known in a smaller group, to be vulnerable, when we grapple with our faith and work out our love for Jesus together, we have a natural accountability with these people. And all this leads to our kind of landing point here this morning, because small groups can and should be about our mission to the world. How? Well, there's two things I want to just finish with this morning. Firstly, there's the reality that a small group is often much more accessible to non-Christians. Imagine you're a not yet Christian and you get an invite to come along to a church service, and it's a beautiful building, but it's quite commanding. It's different to any other building that you regularly go into. And you know that there's going to be a whole bunch of people there. And our two churches are very special because if you're late, everyone knows it, because both the doors for Buchanan and Drymen are right at the front, and you have to come in and everyone's like looking at you. Imagine you're doing that and you've never been into a church environment. We're also comfortable with it because many of you will have been Christians for a long time. You've grown up in faith. Imagine what it's like for somebody to come into that environment, not to know what to dress like, not know when to sit or stand or what to do. It can be such an alien experience for someone exploring faith. So imagine an alternative and being invited by a friend to come to their house that you know and sit in their lounge with a small group of really nice people who are grappling with the issues of life and faith over coffee and cake or Prosecco and crisps. Churches that are growing tends to be the ones with small groups. It's a place where the youngest in faith can learn from those further along the journey, like I did from Chris. It's a place where we can be eased out of our ruts or reinvigorated by the ones that are excited in that first flush of excitement of their faith. But the final piece of the jigsaw puzzle this morning is actually front and centre in this passage. Because remember, this was written to a group of Christians and it was spurring them on in how to be church. It was basically a kind of like how-to guide. This is how you are church. And it's super practical advice it gives. Like it says, don't give up meeting together like some have. Instead, it says, spur one another on towards love and good deeds. The Good News Bible says, help one another to love and do good. My favourite translation says this, let us consider how to provoke each other to love and good deeds. I love that word, provoke each other. Now, we might articulate that in slightly different language, because by love and good deeds, it's just a colloquial way of saying all the stuff that we've been saying for the last 3 years. Is love and good deeds not living out God's empire? Isn't it doing Jesus type stuff? Isn't it mission? When we are taking part in God's mission, are we not doing good deeds and loving, like feeding the hungry, fighting injustice, easing climate change, communicating Jesus' love, making peace, healing people, caring for those with mental health problems? Are these not good deeds? Small groups can, and they should be places where we're not just loved and pastored, not just where we can invite friends, not just places to learn more about the Bible, but they are places where we can provoke each other to love others and do good deeds. And so a small group doesn't and shouldn't really just be a comfy huddle. It shouldn't be an end in and of itself. They are places where we can potentially, even better than we do in a bigger church environment, do the things of being a Christian, do mission, do good stuff. So in a lot of ways, you could say that a small group is like a mini church, because what is church if it's not a group of people gathered together to love God and to love others? So this sets a bit of the context for what will be happening over the next couple of months as we invite leaders and members to gather together in small groups. Now, it's important to say that we're not expecting small groups to immediately embrace everything that we've said this morning. A lot of it will take time. And we're in this important stage of consolidation as a church. So there will be a natural focus on relationship building and on Bible study. But what's in front of us today now is an invitation to delve deeper into this faith of ours. And as Hebrews tells us, our collective faith is gathered around what or who? It's gathered around Jesus, who died to give us access to God. May you be blessed this week. I really hope that you are in a good place with God, and we are praying for you. And if there's anything you need, please don't hesitate to get in touch with myself or Mary or any of the team in the church. See you later. Bye-bye.